The billionaire thought it was priceless. The waitress knew it was fake. The most expensive mistakes are usually the ones people are proud to make. The applause echoed through the grand ballroom of the Hawthorne Hotel in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across hundreds of elegantly dressed guests gathered for one of the city's most prestigious charity auctions. Waiters moved quietly between tables carrying silver trays and champagne flutes, while collectors, investors, and celebrities celebrated another successful evening. At the center of the room stood Jonathan Reed, 46 years old, billionaire investor, famous collector of rare artifacts, a man whose opinion could influence entire markets. Moments earlier, he had won the final item of the evening after an intense bidding war. The room had erupted with admiration when the auctioneer announced the price. Nearly $2 million. Jonathan wore the smile of a man who believed he had secured something extraordinary. Resting inside a glass display case was an antique Swiss pocket watch. According to the auction catalog, it was one of the rarest surviving examples ever discovered. Historians had praised it. Experts had authenticated it. Collectors had chased it for years. And now it belonged to him. Guests gathered around the display to admire the piece. Cameras flashed. Conversations filled the room. Jonathan accepted congratulations with practiced confidence. He had spent decades building a reputation for recognizing value before anyone else. Finding hidden opportunities was what made him successful. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter carried a tray of champagne toward a group of guests near the stage. Her black waitress uniform and white apron blended into the background of the luxurious event. Most people never looked twice at her. They saw a server. Nothing more. Emily moved carefully through the crowd until her eyes landed on the watch inside the display case. She slowed. For a brief moment, everything around her seemed to fade. The conversations, the music, the applause. Her attention narrowed to a single detail. Something small, almost invisible. Her heartbeat quickened. She stepped closer. Just one step, then another. The closer she looked, the more certain she became. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. No, that could not be right. She examined it again from a different angle. The same conclusion stared back at her. Emily stood perfectly still. Around her, wealthy collectors praised Jonathan's purchase. One guest called it a masterpiece. Another described it as priceless. Jonathan smiled and thanked them. Then Emily noticed a tiny marking near the edge of the watch case. A detail most people would never see. A detail her father had taught her to recognize years ago. Suddenly she knew exactly what she was looking at. Her fingers tightened around the tray. She could walk away, say nothing, continue her shift. Nobody expected a waitress to challenge experts, historians, and billionaires. Nobody would blame her for staying silent. Yet as she watched the guests admire the watch, one thought refused to leave her mind. If she remained quiet, a lie would become the truth. And before she could stop herself, Emily Carter took a slow breath, stepped forward, and prepared to say the words that would change the entire evening. Emily Carter had learned long ago that most people never noticed the details that mattered. As she stood beside the display case, her eyes remained fixed on the antique pocket watch while the ballroom buzzed with admiration. The tiny marking she had spotted was impossible for most guests to recognize. Yet for Emily, it felt as obvious as a misspelled word in a headline. Her father had spent nearly 30 years restoring and authenticating vintage timepieces. Their small family workshop in Connecticut had never made anyone rich, but it had filled her childhood with lessons that few people her age ever received. While other children watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, Emily often sat beside her father beneath bright work lamps, listening as he explained the difference between craftsmanship and imitation. He used to tell her that every object carried a story. Real pieces carried honest stories. Fake pieces borrowed stories they did not earn. She still remembered his hands holding tiny watch components beneath a magnifying lens. She remembered him showing her hidden engravings, unique serial patterns, and subtle imperfections that proved authenticity. Most importantly, she remembered what he always repeated. Never trust the label. Trust the details. Years later, After her father's passing, those lessons remained with her. Even when life changed direction. Even when medical bills forced her family to sell the workshop. Even when she traded business school dreams for long shifts carrying trays through crowded dining rooms. Knowledge had stayed with her. And tonight, that knowledge was creating a problem. Emily glanced around the ballroom. Nobody else seemed concerned. Wealthy collectors admired the watch from a distance. Reporters took photographs. Auction staff celebrated another successful sale. The room had already accepted a conclusion. The watch was priceless. Jonathan Reed was the winner. The story was finished. Except Emily knew something they did not. The story had barely begun. A fellow waitress passed beside her carrying a tray of sparkling water. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. Emily hesitated. "I am not sure." The waitress followed her gaze toward the display case. "That watch." Emily nodded. "Something is wrong." Her coworker laughed softly. "Looks expensive enough to me." Emily almost smiled. That was exactly the problem. Most people saw price. Her father had taught her to see proof. Across the room, Jonathan continued speaking with guests who congratulated him on the purchase. He looked relaxed, confident, certain. The certainty bothered her more than the price tag ever could. Emily knew she should return to work. Several tables still needed service. Guests expected drinks. Managers expected efficiency. Yet every time she started to walk away, her eyes returned to the same tiny detail on the watch case. The flaw sat there quietly, hidden beneath layers of prestige and assumptions. Finally, Emily made a decision. It was not comfortable. It was not safe. But it felt necessary. She adjusted her white apron, steadied the tray in her hands, and began walking toward the crowd surrounding Jonathan Reed. With every step, the voices around her grew louder. The closer she came, the more impossible her decision seemed. After all, who would believe a waitress over a room full of experts? Jonathan Reed had spent most of his adult life becoming the kind of man people rarely questioned. Success created a certain gravity. The larger his reputation grew, the more people assumed he was correct before he even spoke. Investors trusted him. Collectors admired him. Auction houses welcomed him. Entire industries paid attention when he made a decision. Tonight was no different. The antique pocket watch resting inside the glass case had become the crown jewel of the evening. Every expert associated with the auction had praised its authenticity. Every document supported its history. Every collector in the room wanted it. And Jonathan had won. He stood surrounded by admirers while cameras flashed around him. A reporter asked what attracted him to the piece. Jonathan smiled confidently. Real value is about recognizing something rare before everyone else understands what they are seeing. Several guests nodded in agreement. It sounded exactly like something a billionaire collector would say. Nearby, Emily continued moving through the crowd. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier than before. Her heart was steady, but her thoughts were not. She understood the risk. If she spoke up and she was wrong, she would embarrass herself. Worse, she could embarrass the hotel. Yet the closer she came to the display case, the more impossible silence became. Jonathan accepted another congratulation from a wealthy donor before noticing movement at the edge of the crowd. Emily had stopped several feet away. For a moment their eyes met. Jonathan barely registered her presence. To him, she was simply part of the event staff. Another employee passing through the room. Then Emily spoke. Her voice was calm, not loud, not dramatic, yet somehow it carried through the conversation around them. "Excuse me, sir." The nearest guests turned. Jonathan looked toward her politely. "Yes." Emily glanced at the watch, then back at him. "I think there may be a problem." A few people exchanged confused looks. Jonathan smiled politely. "What kind of problem?" Emily hesitated for only a second. "I do not believe that watch is authentic." The room froze. Not completely, but enough. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. A reporter lowered his camera. Someone near the back laughed softly, assuming it was a joke. Jonathan stared at her for a moment, almost expecting her to smile. She did not. Her expression remained composed. Serious. Certain. The laughter spread slightly through the crowd. One guest shook his head in disbelief. Another whispered something to a friend. Jonathan finally let out a quiet chuckle. That is a remarkable claim. Emily nodded. I know. And what makes you think every expert involved in this auction missed something? The question drew more smiles from the crowd. It sounded impossible. Emily could feel dozens of eyes fixed on her. Wealthy collectors, historians, journalists, people who expected her confidence to disappear under pressure. Instead, she looked directly at the display case. Then she looked back at Jonathan Reed. Because they were looking at the story, she said softly. I was looking at the watch. For several seconds, nobody knew how to respond. The ballroom remained suspended in an uncomfortable silence that seemed almost impossible just moments earlier. Jonathan Reed studied the waitress standing before him. He expected uncertainty, regret, perhaps even an apology. Instead, Emily Carter remained completely calm. Her tray rested steadily in her hands. Her expression never changed. Around them, guests exchanged curious glances. Some appeared amused. Others seemed annoyed that a charity auction had suddenly become awkward. Finally, Jonathan smiled. It was the kind of smile successful people often used when they believed a situation was beneath them. You realize, he said gently, that this watch has been authenticated by professionals. Several guests nodded immediately. The confidence returned to the room. Emily nodded as well. I know. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. And yet you believe they are wrong? I believe they overlooked something. A few people laughed. The sound was softer than before but still present. One collector standing near the display case folded his arms. Young lady, he said, do you have any idea how many experts examined this piece? Emily looked at him respectfully. No, the man smiled. More than enough. More laughter followed. Jonathan glanced toward the display case and then back at Emily. Let us assume for a moment that you are correct. What exactly did everyone miss? The question hung in the air. Emily carefully placed her tray on a nearby table. Then she stepped closer to the watch. Guests instinctively moved aside. Not because they believed her, because curiosity had begun replacing confidence. Emily leaned slightly toward the glass case. The engraving. Several people frowned. Jonathan looked at the watch. What about it? Emily pointed toward a nearly invisible section near the lower edge of the case. The depth is wrong. Confused expressions spread through the crowd. One reporter stepped closer. Another guest adjusted his glasses. Jonathan looked unconvinced. That is what this is about? Emily nodded. The original manufacturer used hand engraving during that period. Jonathan crossed his arms. And hand engraving leaves tiny inconsistencies. She looked directly at him. This engraving is too perfect. The room grew quieter. Not silent, but quieter. A few guests moved closer to the display case. One auction representative approached with concern visible on his face. Jonathan remained composed. You can see all of that through glass? Emily shook her head. No. Then how are you so certain? For the first time all evening, Emily hesitated. Not because she doubted herself. Because she knew exactly how unbelievable her answer would sound. Because I have seen the original. The ballroom reacted immediately. Gasps, whispers, confused looks. Jonathan stared at her. You have seen the original? Emily nodded. Years ago. Someone laughed nervously. Another guest whispered that this was becoming ridiculous. Yet Jonathan noticed something important. Emily never sounded defensive. She never raised her voice. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply stated facts. And somehow that made her more difficult to dismiss. Jonathan looked back at the watch inside the case. Then at Emily. For the first time that evening, a small seed of doubt appeared in his mind. It was tiny, barely noticeable, but it was there. And once doubt enters a room filled with certainty, everything begins to change. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Less than 10 minutes earlier, guests had been celebrating Jonathan Reed's purchase. Now they were studying the glass display case with growing uncertainty. Conversations that once sounded confident had become cautious whispers. Reporters remained nearby, sensing that something unexpected might be unfolding. Jonathan stood motionless beside the watch. His expression remained controlled, but his attention never left Emily Carter. Most people who challenged him eventually became emotional, defensive, eager to prove themselves. Emily did none of those things. That alone made her difficult to dismiss. An auction representative stepped forward and adjusted his glasses. "You claim you have seen the original watch?" Emily nodded. "Yes." "Where?" "In my father's workshop." Several guests exchanged skeptical looks. The representative frowned. "And your father was?" "A restoration specialist." The room grew quieter. Emily continued calmly. Collectors occasionally brought rare pieces to him for evaluation or repair. Jonathan looked at her carefully. "You are saying this exact watch passed through his workshop?" "No," Emily shook her head. "I am saying the original did." The distinction mattered. Jonathan noticed that immediately. She chose her words carefully. Every answer seemed precise, deliberate. The representative glanced toward the display case again. "Even if that were true, you still have not proven anything." Emily nodded. "I agree." The response surprised him. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to establish a fact. There was a difference. Emily stepped slightly closer to the case. "May I ask a question?" Jonathan gestured for her to continue. "When was the authentication completed?" The representative answered immediately. 3 months ago." Emily nodded again. "And did the examination include microscopic imaging of the engraving?" The representative hesitated. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared on his face. "I would have to review the report." Emily remained silent. She did not smile. She did not react. Yet the hesitation itself seemed to ripple through the crowd. Jonathan noticed it. So did everyone else. A collector standing near the front folded his arms. "Why does that matter?" Emily looked at him. "Because modern engraving tools can create precision that did not exist when this watch was originally manufactured." The collector frowned. "You are suggesting someone copied it?" "I am suggesting someone copied something." Another silence settled over the room. Jonathan glanced at the watch again. For the first time, he was not seeing a masterpiece. He was seeing a question. The difference felt unsettling. Then Emily pointed toward the lower edge of the case. "There is another detail." Several people leaned forward instinctively. "The serial sequence." Jonathan looked up. "What about it?" Emily took a slow breath. "If I am right, one number is missing." The room became perfectly still. Not because anyone believed her yet. Because for the first time, they realized she might actually know something the experts had overlooked. And somewhere beneath the crystal chandeliers and polished elegance of the ballroom, confidence was beginning to give way to doubt. The auction representative immediately requested the authentication file. Within minutes, assistants were moving through the ballroom carrying tablets and printed reports, while guests gathered closer around the display case. Nobody seemed interested in champagne anymore. Nobody cared about the dessert tables. The watch had become the center of the evening. Jonathan Reed stood silently beside the glass case, his attention fixed on Emily Carter. Earlier, he had viewed her as part of the background. Now she had become the only person in the room everyone wanted to hear from. One of the senior appraisers arrived carrying a magnifying loupe and several documents. His expression suggested confidence, but there was caution beneath it. "Let us settle this properly," he said. The crowd welcomed the suggestion. Emily stepped back slightly. She did not move closer. She did not attempt to take control. She simply watched. The appraiser carefully examined the watch through the glass. Then he requested permission to open the case. Jonathan nodded. The room became remarkably quiet. The watch was removed and placed beneath a bright examination lamp. Every eye followed the movement. The appraiser inspected the engraving first. Several long minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Jonathan to notice. "What is it?" Jonathan asked. The appraiser did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the magnifier and looked again. Across the room, a reporter slowly lowered his notebook. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving. Finally, the appraiser looked up. "The engraving is unusually precise." A murmur spread through the crowd. Emily remained still. Jonathan folded his arms. "Unusually precise does not mean fake." "No," the appraiser agreed. "It does not." He returned to the watch and examined another section. This time he focused on the serial sequence Emily had mentioned. His brow tightened. He compared the numbers against a digital archive displayed on a tablet. Then he checked again. The silence became almost unbearable. Jonathan felt something unfamiliar growing inside him. Not fear. Not yet. Uncertainty. The appraiser took a slow breath. "There appears to be an inconsistency." Several guests exchanged startled looks. Jonathan stepped forward. "What kind of inconsistency?" The appraiser pointed toward the serial sequence. "According to the manufacturer's records, this production series should contain an additional marking here." He touched a location near the edge of the case. "This watch does not." The ballroom erupted into whispers. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Not because she felt victorious, because she already knew what was coming next. The appraiser continued examining the piece. Every passing minute seemed to pull the room further away from certainty. Jonathan glanced toward Emily. She showed no satisfaction, no triumph, only patience. That unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Most people wanted to be proven right. Emily seemed interested only in the truth. Another expert joined the examination. Then another. The atmosphere shifted completely. The same professionals who had confidently authenticated the watch were now questioning their own conclusions. And standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, wearing a simple waitress uniform and white apron, Emily Carter watched as the story surrounding the priceless watch began to crack beneath the weight of a single overlooked detail. Nearly 30 minutes had passed since Emily Carter first questioned the watch. What began as a brief interruption had become the only thing anyone in the ballroom cared about. The charity auction had effectively stopped. Guests remained gathered around the examination table while experts compared records, photographs, and manufacturing archives. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place stood something far more powerful: doubt. Jonathan Reed stood quietly near the front of the crowd. His expression remained controlled, but internally he was fighting a battle he rarely faced. He had spent years trusting his judgment, years believing that experience protected people from costly mistakes. Yet every new detail seemed to move the evening in the same direction. Emily had not raised her voice. She had not pressured anyone. She had simply pointed toward the truth and allowed everyone else to walk toward it. One of the senior historians finally lowered a tablet onto the table. Another expert removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The atmosphere felt heavier than before. Nobody wanted to be the first person to say what everyone was beginning to suspect. Emily remained near the edge of the room. She had resumed holding her tray. The image almost seemed absurd. A waitress standing quietly while some of the most respected specialists in the field struggled to explain their mistake. Jonathan looked toward her. She did not appear nervous. She did not appear triumphant. If anything, she looked slightly sad. That surprised him. Then the lead appraiser stood up. The movement immediately silenced the room. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The man looked around the ballroom before speaking. "We have completed a secondary review." His voice was calm but noticeably different from earlier. "Additional examination confirms that the watch contains manufacturing characteristics inconsistent with the documented period." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The appraiser continued. "The serial sequence is incomplete. The engraving method appears modern. The internal construction also differs from verified examples." Jonathan stared at the watch. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Then the appraiser delivered the sentence everyone had been waiting for. The piece is not authentic. Silence. Complete silence. No whispers. No laughter. No movement. Only the sound of distant air conditioning moving through the ballroom. Jonathan slowly closed his eyes. Not because of the money. $2 million would not change his life. What hurt was something else. The certainty. The assumption. The belief that he could not be fooled. Across the room, several guests lowered their heads. Others stared at Emily in disbelief. The waitress had been right from the beginning. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked directly at her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Emily set her tray gently on a nearby table and said the only thing she had wanted anyone to understand all evening. The easiest people to fool are those who already believe they cannot be fooled. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They settled over the ballroom with the weight of truth. And judging by the silence that followed, every person in the room understood exactly what she meant. For several moments after Emily spoke, nobody moved. The silence felt different now. Earlier, it had been uncertainty. Now it was understanding. The truth had arrived, and there was nothing left to debate. Jonathan Reed stood beside the examination table looking at the watch that had captivated the room only an hour before. Under the bright lights, it appeared exactly the same as before. The same polished case. The same elegant craftsmanship. The same impressive appearance. Yet somehow everything had changed. The value people assigned to it had vanished the moment they learned the truth. Jonathan found himself staring at that contradiction. A fake object could look identical to the real thing. What separated them was not appearance. It was authenticity. Across the ballroom, guests slowly began talking again. Reporters quietly compared notes. Auction officials discussed procedures. Experts reviewed documentation, trying to understand how the mistake had happened. Yet Jonathan barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on Emily Carter. She had not moved closer to the center of attention. She had not accepted congratulations. In fact, she appeared ready to return to work as if the evening had been entirely ordinary. That puzzled him more than anything else. Finally, Jonathan walked toward her. The crowd instinctively made room. Not because he was a billionaire, because they wanted to hear what would happen next. Emily looked up as he approached. Her expression remained calm. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. "How long did it take you?" he asked. Emily tilted her head slightly. "To notice?" Jonathan nodded. "Less than a minute." Several nearby guests exchanged astonished looks. Jonathan let out a slow breath. "And you were certain?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I was certain enough to ask questions." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That sounds different." "It is different." Emily glanced toward the watch. "Certainty closes doors. Questions open them." The sentence lingered in the air. Jonathan understood immediately why she had seen what others missed. She had not entered the room trying to prove she was right. She had entered trying to discover whether something was wrong. The difference seemed small, yet it had changed everything. One of the historians approached and thanked Emily for speaking up. Then another expert did the same. A reporter requested an interview. Emily politely declined. She thanked them and returned her attention to a nearby table where several glasses still needed clearing. The sight was almost surreal. Moments earlier she had corrected some of the most respected specialists in the room. Now she was collecting empty champagne flutes. Jonathan watched her for a long moment. Success had introduced him to countless intelligent people. Analysts, advisors, executives, professors. Yet very few possessed the quiet confidence he had witnessed tonight. Emily never needed attention to validate her knowledge. She never needed applause to confirm her worth. And standing beneath the glow of the ballroom chandeliers, Jonathan began to realize that was exactly what made her extraordinary. The ballroom slowly returned to life, but it was not the same room that had existed earlier that evening. Conversations sounded quieter. Laughter felt more thoughtful. The guests who had arrived expecting to witness another successful auction were leaving with a different story entirely. Jonathan Reed stood near the display table for several more minutes, watching people file past the watch that no longer commanded admiration. Nothing about its appearance had changed. Only the truth had. That thought stayed with him. Eventually he walked toward Emily Carter one final time. She was stacking empty glasses onto a serving tray, focused on finishing the work she had started hours earlier. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One of the most respected collectors in the country was approaching her, and she remained more concerned about completing her responsibilities than enjoying attention. Jonathan stopped beside her. "Emily." She looked up. "Yes." For a moment he searched for the right words. The apology came easier than he expected. "I owe you my thanks." Emily offered a polite smile. "You do not owe me anything." Jonathan glanced toward the watch. "You saved me from making a very public mistake." Emily shook her head gently. "The experts found the truth. Because you gave them a reason to look again." Neither spoke for a few seconds. Around them, staff members began preparing the ballroom for closing. Tables were cleared. Decorations were removed. The evening was ending. Jonathan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. "If you ever want a different career, call me." Emily looked at the card but did not immediately take it. Jonathan smiled. "That is not a job offer." No. It is an invitation. Smart people should have options." Emily accepted the card and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Thank you." Jonathan nodded. Then he asked the question that had remained in his mind all evening. "Why did you say something?" Emily looked toward the empty display case. "Because my father spent his life teaching people to respect the truth." Her voice softened slightly. "If I had stayed silent, I would have been disrespecting everything he taught me." Jonathan lowered his eyes for a moment. He understood that answer better than she realized. Success had taught him many lessons. Tonight had reminded him of one he had nearly forgotten. Character mattered more than reputation. Knowledge mattered more than confidence. Truth mattered more than appearances. Emily picked up her tray and prepared to leave. Jonathan stepped aside to let her pass. As she walked away, she looked no different than she had at the beginning of the evening. Same uniform, same apron, same quiet demeanor. Yet everyone who watched her now saw something entirely different. Not a waitress, not background, not someone to overlook. They saw a person whose wisdom had changed the course of an entire evening with nothing more than observation, patience, and courage. Jonathan remained standing beneath the fading chandelier light as she disappeared through the ballroom doors. And as he watched her leave, he realized the most valuable thing in the room had never been the watch. It was the woman who recognized the truth when everyone else was distracted by the price. Because value belongs to those who understand it, not those who can afford it.